Thanks everyone for coming. I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. My name's Alex, I work here in Northern Plains, and just wanted to thank Mr. Tom Schneider for coming down and giving us his time. We'll let him introduce himself and all, but I guess go right ahead.
That's pretty straightforward. You mind if I take my coat off?
Yes.
Cool. So I see a few familiar faces and lots of folks that I don't know. So let me introduce myself as Tom Schneider. I've been connected with Northern Plains at some level for 40 plus years. Served 3 separate terms on the Montana Public Service Commission. Was elected twice out of the southeastern district of Montana from Big Timber to the North Dakota border. Yellowstone right in the guts of it, of course. And then I lost a primary in '84. That changed my life and career path. I had a consulting practice for the next 16 or 17 years, and then was living in Helena. Ran for the commission again in 2002, and served 4 more years. So a total of 3 terms over a 30-year plus period. The excuse me, greatest, most satisfying career track imaginable. So I'm down here to talk about Colstrip, which also has been a dominant theme in my career and life during that entire 40-year period from the mid-70s to date. And I had the opportunity in the spring of this year to present as part of a panel on the future of coal at the Northern Hotel. Was sponsored by the Wheeler Center out of MSU. Chuck Tooley, I think, is the head of it now. Anybody at that Future of Coal conference? A couple folks, 3. So the upshot of that was that Teresa Erickson indicated that Northern Plains had an interest in some follow-up discussions or presentation, especially related to the transmission matters that I talked about. And that there were folks in Colstrip, labor and otherwise, that were also interested in a follow-up to that Future of Coal conference. So it's been churning as an idea and an invite for the last 6 months, and I am greatly relieved that we're finally proceeding in and gonna kind of put that responsibility to rest. I'm honored to be here. I don't think that I've actually ever been in home on the range, which is pretty phenomenal given my long connection with Northern Plains, but I'm very impressed, of course. So let's get down to business now. There was there is a handout on the desks I have. There are more on the table back there related to a schematic on transmission. And one of the questions that was posed to me is to kind of identify and describe transmission at a high level. So this schematic that is part of an important report that I'll be discussing really does capture the transmission system across Montana from Colstrip to the Idaho border up by Hot Springs and Taft. The key components of it are, that I'm going to talk about at various points, are the segments from Colstrip to Broadview, which is north of Billings, and on to Townsend, Montana, which is north of Three Forks, between Three Forks and Helena. Townsend, and then on to Garrison. That's the portion that I'm going to spend most of my time on. And then it continues the line, the twin 500 kV line, transmitting all of the power from the 4 plants at Colstrip and other power that's fed in that area, up to the Pacific Northwest connections at the Idaho border. The blue link or segments from Colstrip through Broadview to Townsend is owned by 5 investor-owned utilities. Those 5 investor-owned utilities have pro rata shares in Colstrip 3 and 4, and they also have pro rata shares in the ownership of that transmission. At Townsend, Bonneville Power Administration constructed the remainder of the line from Townsend to the Idaho border up in the Taft area near Hot Springs. They changed the configuration of the transmission, but the transmission capability to transmit electricity remained the same. It's just that the tower design has changed from a twin parallel 500 kV lines from Colstrip to Townsend to a single tower configuration, double hung the rest of the way through Bonneville's system. So the ownership is very important, because the ownership of the generation and transmission drives the decisions that are made related to both generation and transmission. In the old days, in the old Montana Power days, when these facilities were constructed, that was Montana Power, and they were the owner and operator of one of the owners and the operator of the generating plants and the transmission line. That changed, of course, with their divestiture of generation in the 1997 range, and divestiture of the mining operations as well. So it went through that iteration, and then on to the iteration where Northwestern acquired the surviving Montana Power interest in the transmission. Montana Power, or Northwestern now, still retains a 30% share of Colstrip 4, and that is split between 3 and 4 just in terms of a reliability standpoint with Talon. So Montana Power has a combined 30% share, but 15% effectively in each plant. Okay, so lots of discussion about the retirement of Colstrip 1 and 2. Those are the smaller units. They were constructed in the mid-70s, came online in the 75 range. And those are jointly owned by Puget Sound Energy, which serves the Seattle area, and Talon, which was the successor to Montana, PPL Montana, successor to the old Montana Power Company. So 50% owned by Puget, and 50% by Talon, as part of a settlement with Sierra and Sierra Club and MEIC. Those plants will be retired not later than July of 2022, so 4 more years. That is quite a bit of lead time in terms of the real commercial world, in terms of getting your house in order. There is a set time frame. The decision by the owners could be earlier than that, but that's the outside limit in terms of when those plants will be retired. So with the retirement of those plants, a number of things kick in. One of them is reclamation and decommissioning and dismantling of facilities associated with that activity that will have job and employment impacts going forward. And then, well, what happens then to the power that used to go from Colstrip to Seattle? It's no longer going from Colstrip 1 and 2. Well, that portion of the line that is owned by Puget then becomes available to transmit other power. And the issue and the question from a reliability of the grid standpoint was, will that have reliability impacts? Can that line be operated in a way, those lines, be operated in a way that is still reliable if those two older, smaller units go down? And the answer is yes, it can. Studies are definitive that replacement power, whether it be renewables or gas-fired or pumped hydro storage or batteries, whatever the source of power is, can be transmitted over those facilities. It'll need to be connected, it'll need to have a market, but from a reliability and physical standpoint, there is not a barrier. With all the changes going forward, there are also going to be changes required in terms of the electrical protection systems that govern the operation of that big Colstrip transmission line. It's very sophisticated now. It has to do with the contingency and reliability of a potential loss of one or both of those lines or some other emergency in the western interconnection. But the ability to protect that system, the communications, the technology, the understanding has been in place since those units came online. So all of the owning utilities agree that the studies demonstrate that there is not going to be a deterioration of reliability, and that they can maintain exports to the Northwest, assuming they get market in the Northwest, and that's not a done deal. So in the past couple of months, during that Future of Coal conference, the governor and the Bonneville Power Administration, the head of BPA, which is a federal power marketing agency and the biggest electricity transmission player in the Northwest, and the constructor of the power line from Townsend to Idaho, convened a task force that involved virtually all of the key players in terms of transmission owners, generation owners, renewable resource developers, Public Service Commission and Public Utility Commissions from throughout the West, public advocates, all kinds of folks came together for a really intensive 6-month effort at trying to address the issues of a renewable development action plan in light of changes at Colstrip. The change that we know about is 1 and 2. The ultimate changes will occur at some unknown future date related to decisions on 3 and 4. But everybody recognized that we needed to have a serious, high-level, focused effort in terms of trying to define the future and what was possible and what made sense. So to his great credit, the head of the Bonneville Power Administration requested that the governor participate as a co-sponsor of this big regional project. Again, it's regional because 70% of the ownership of the transmission and the generation at 3 and 4 reside in the Northwest on the I-5 corridor and Avista and Spokane. So you've got Avista, you've got Puget, you've got Portland General, and you've got Pacific Core. Those are the 4 other utilities besides Northwestern. And then you've got this big federal entity, Bonneville. All of them have a major stake in what happens going forward, as all of us do. What we've been concerned about from the outset, in addition to the reliability of these big changes, was whether or not there were real prospect of renewable resource development in Montana that would take advantage of and move in to backfill that loss of Colstrip. Was there a market on the West Coast that was interested in that supply? Was it going to be competitive with supplies in the Columbia Gorge and other options that are available in the Northwest? What happens in terms of the impact on the community, on employment? All of those things were bubbling around in terms of, what happens now. And as far as I am concerned, having participated in all of them, all of the meetings, all of the conference calls, on the technical committees and on the policy and commercial committees, is that this report that was issued by Bonneville and the governor at the end of June represents a real significant step forward in terms of defining the baseline of availability of transmission now to move renewable power, as well as what's going to be available when 1 and 2 go down, and what can be done and what's available in terms of transmission capacity and availability when 3 and 4 go down at some unknown date in the future. So the beauty of the plan, in my view, is that it is not only technically and commercially substantive and positive about that future, but it represents something that you can really put your hands around and rely on. That's coming from 40 plus years of experience. That doesn't happen very often. It's almost always, a pretty nasty exchange about some of these issues. Anyway, it's not to say that process wasn't tough, because it was. But what Bonneville brought in terms of their leadership and their really significant role in the entire Northwest was they they were able to leverage and bring together all of the key players and drive the process to an action plan. And that action plan now has a follow-up in terms of the steps and the recommendations that have been made and what the time frame of those are. There's going to be 90-day report issued the end of September, and then there's going to be a in-face meeting 90 days after that. So it's not going to be something that's dumped on a shelf somewhere. It has a follow-up mechanism to make sure that the actions are moved forward. About the same time that plan was issued by this, as a result of this big collaborative process, another report was issued that was prepared at the request of the Montana Chamber of Commerce and prepared by the Bureau of Economic Research at Missoula. And it was a follow-up to a study that they had done a couple of years prior to that as part of the Clean Power Plan scare. And I was very critical of the first study and equally critical of the second study because of the underlying assumptions. But these two, and as a result of that, these coming out at about the same time, within a week of each other, I had the opportunity of preparing an op-ed, which we have copies of and they'll be distributed. But I don't want to distribute it right now because I want to talk to you. Anyway, that op-ed was intended to contrast those two futures, one being if anything happens before 2043 at Colstrip, it is the end of the world and you son of a guns are to blame for these catastrophic economic impacts, versus a real solid look at what is the transmission capability, what is the likely, what do we know about the energy future, what is likely ultimately going to occur. Anyway, big contrast. And then did a reality check on what do we know now, and finally a path forward, which really is based very heavily on the Bonneville Governor Report. So the timing of this invitation remained important, certainly important to me. I figure if I'm going to put my name on something, I better be able to come down and look you in the eye and talk about it. And that's what I'm going to do this evening down at Colstrip. That is a little bit more apprehensive for me, but you know, I've been around a long time. What can they do to me, right? Anyway, again, I'm thankful to be sharing some of these ideas with you. So, again, 1 and 2 go down in no later than July of 2022. Puget's share then is available to transmit whatever replacement power is able to secure a contract for that transmission and in the marketplace. Right now, Puget Sound Energy and Portland General, two of the owners of transmission and generation at Colstrip, have RFPs out soliciting new resources. So developers in Montana now have and will have in the relatively near future access to transmission, which they heretofore had not had access to, and particularly after 1 and 2 go down. So there's a modest amount that's available now, in the 300 megawatt range. By way of comparison, the total Colstrip complex is around 2,100. Colstrip 1 and 2 around 6, and 3 and 4, 14 to 1,500. So that gives you a relative idea. There are a lot of proposals that are likely to respond from Montana to those RFPs. So if the question is there anything real out there that could take advantage of that transmission to fill that need that's left by 1 and 2 going down? The answer is yeah. I think there's a high probability of a number of those projects competing in that market. That market is very competitive. Washington and Oregon have wind resources of their own. They have a vested interest of their own in their own jobs, their own economic development, keeping things close to home, just as we do. So it's not a slam dunk at all. They're going to have to be aggressively priced, but the key is, do they have secure transmission to enter those contracts? And up to this point, they have not had that. Getting a transmission contract involves getting first an interconnection agreement with the transmission owner. In this case, Northwestern operates that line. And then a transmission service request approval, and they need to put up real money to get that study work done. And it's a really significant barrier if they don't have a contract on the other end. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. The people on the other end are saying, how can we give you a contract? You don't have any transmission, right? So this project tried to address that in a way of recommending that these utilities in the Northwest provide a legitimate opportunity to evaluate the resources and how competitive they are, and a legitimate opportunity or window for entities to enter the contracts for transmission and go ahead and put the money up now that they see a market contract at the end. So I think that's a big step. It's not the final answer, and there's no guarantees at this point, but that is a really significant breakthrough in terms of the way that Montana could potentially compete in that market. So the entities that own the transmission, again, the 5 investor-owned utilities that I've identified, plus Bonneville, have a contract over the Montana Intertie called the Montana Intertie Agreement, which appears to restrict the use of third-party wheeling across those facilities, across that transmission line. And that was one of the main focuses of my involvement, was to try and mitigate that absolute barrier in terms of not only 1 and 2 going down and Puget's ownership and use of their transmission be open, but going forward that the entire transmission line be open and available to transmit electricity for any of the parties that own the transmission. So the 5 owners, 5 IOUs and Bonneville have begun negotiations and discussions to address that third-party wheeling issue that's problematic in that old 1981 contract. I think they're optimistic that they can get from here to there, because all of them have a vested interest in being able to use their ownership share post Colstrip. So it affects 1 and 2 immediately, and the use of that line, a portion of that line, and ultimately 3 and 4 in terms of being able to utilize and transmit renewables and other generation for the future after 3 and after 4. Really significant progress, I think. An old issue related again to Bonneville and Northwestern had to do with also this portion between Townsend and Garrison had a special rate called the Montana Intertie rate, which also was a barrier, is a barrier, kind of an adder that was making Montana resources less competitive than it otherwise would be. They reached agreement as a result of all of the activity and pressure and commitments of this process to get that issue resolved, and it is resolved. Either Northwestern and Bonneville, either one of those entities can contract to sell power across that link now without this separate tariff that was causing a lot of trouble. So it's not perfect, but really is a significant thing for 184 megawatts that had been stranded before. And 184 megawatts doesn't sound like much. But remember, in Montana, it wasn't until 2005 that the Judith Gap project was first approved and developed. That was 135 megawatts, and that was a huge breakthrough in Montana. The first significant wind project happened to occur on part of my watch. And so this 184 megawatts, while it is not a huge amount, is a really important step forward. Anyway, lots of things lining up in terms of the path forward that I'm optimistic about. I think that it bodes well for Montana in terms of its energy future. And I think it bodes well for the community of Colstrip. That's what I want to switch to now. We have time. I don't know what your time frame is, but I'll keep talking. If you need to leave, I guess you just have to hit the road. I'm going to talk about Colstrip impacts now, community and worker impacts, what I see as pretty attractive opportunities going forward for that community. And I know there is a lot of angst there. It's angst that every one of us have probably felt in the course of our life in terms of job changes and whether it's in metal mining or wood products or whatever it is, we're often faced with the shutdown of an important industry in our community. Colstrip has been really aggressive in terms of trying to protect its interest and its long-term livelihood and reliance on coal plants and coal mining that they've been very proud of. That's their entire career for a lot of people, and I understand all that. What I think going forward is, look at what the realities are and the likelihood of changes going forward, and try and position yourself for the best outcome. And that might mean hedging your bets. Maybe you would much prefer to hold on to that bird that's in the hand. Understand that, all of us understand that, versus that transition to a new approach. But I want to make the case that the transition to the new approach is quite attractive, and that Colstrip as a community and has a lot to offer and has good prospects going forward, in contrast to lots of other communities that have lost their main employer and main livelihood. Colstrip has a wonderfully skilled workforce. It has a community infrastructure that was built for sophisticated people for the long haul, whether it's school system or otherwise. They've had 5 investor-owned utilities plus Talon and PPL Montana that have invested in that community. There's a lot there. The workforce, again, is skilled, and they have the ability now, I will argue that they have the ability now to make plans. If they want to retain, if they want to stay there, if they want to retain their homes, take an optimistic approach to, okay, you've got 3 and 4 are going to be there for some period of time. We don't know how long. And then as they go down, there are really attractive, important jobs in terms of closing the life cycle of that energy production. And that's the decommissioning, the reclamation, the restoration of the lands and the aquifer that have been damaged over the past 40 plus years. Really important jobs, and I think I would advocate and support the idea of making sure that the retraining and redeployment of that high quality labor down there gets a real opportunity to perform that work. I would want, and emphasize how important that is in this transition. That is really long-term, high-quality work. I mean, assuming 3 and 4 go down in 2030, or 2027, or 2035, that is a lot of lead time to get the training and the transition elements in place. Obviously, contract work between, or contract negotiations between labor and the operator is important in terms of training between the 4 plants, the succession plan, the retirements, potential severance, lots of things to look at in a real serious way from a labor and management point of view in terms of making this thing to mitigate and enhance the opportunities for folks to remain there if they want to. And then, in addition to that really important clean it up work, leave it at least as good as it was when you found it. I mean, that's kind of a principle that I live by. They have the opportunity then to participate in renewable resource development. There is a lot of interest in and recognition that in addition to the skilled workforce, they have amazing electrical facilities. They have this lifeline transmission system. They have the substations. They have the communication system to operate big transfers of renewable power. That is a tremendous asset that they have an advantage on because it exists now. They don't have to build new substations to connect. They don't have to pay the owners of the transmission line to put in a new substation or connection. That stuff is essentially there. And they are the experts in the way that operates. So lots of really good advantages. They have solar resources there. I think the wind is not as high quality as it is in some other parts of the state, but they have other advantages that may offset that. So you've got wind, you've got solar. There's also a potential in the report that was identified about using one or more of those units, not in a coal-fired generating capacity, but rather as a synchronous condenser, which provide reliability benefits to the system. It's spinning inertia. It's basically the motor running backwards. And that provides real electrical reliability benefits. That hasn't been proven yet, but it came up in a very serious way as a part of this study project. So that's going to be examined. That again may involve retention of one or more of the units if it makes sense from an economic standpoint. Compared to other ways of getting that inertia or that stability and for the system. So I really do believe that the Colstrip community and labor force and opportunity for investment in alternative resources is very attractive there. It is not a doomsday situation from my standpoint, for sure. And I am hoping that folks seize on that opportunity, embrace it in a good way, even if it's a hedging option. Maybe it's their second choice or third choice, but it beats heck out of lots of places where there are no other choices. That's where I come from. Anyway, thanks for having me down here. Questions? I knew Mary would ask one that I couldn't answer, like she usually does.
Well, I think you can answer these, and it's double, I mean, they're related. First of all, in terms of the reclamation and decommissioning, do the owners of Colstrip have the bonding or other resources to actually do that without tax money? And that's decades, especially when you look at mine reclamation. In terms of land use, can the renewable resources be built before the while reclamation is still going on? I mean,
Don't know the answer to the second one. The first one is Colstrip has, and Montana has some advantages, has some, you're dealing with public utilities that are regulated. Those costs are going to go into rates. They're legitimate end game costs. So from the power plant and plant-related impacts, including, in my view, the aquifer damage related to the fly ash pond, should be addressed in utility rate cases in Montana as well as Washington and Oregon. And I'm confident that regulators will recognize those as legitimate, necessary life cycle costs. So I'm pretty comfortable on the generation-related impacts, which are really significant. The mining is a whole different deal. That is not regulated. That is Westmoreland now has the mining operation. And you know, there have been a lot of discussions about their financial liability and so forth. So I think we as a state have failed in terms of real solid bonding requirements associated with industrial operations. You know, they often will make the case that we're essentially self-insured, we're strong financially. I'm not talking just coal companies, I'm talking about reclamation in Montana. Bonding really is important, and it needs to be significant enough that there is real pot of money there to do the important reclamation and restoration work. I'm less confident that that's the case there, but that's really not my expertise.
Will Montana current codes allow us to allow our public service commissioners to put those restoration costs into the rate base? Is there anything that?
Well, it won't be rate-based, but they will be incorporated into rates. I mean, there is no prohibition at all in terms of being able to cover legitimate costs.
Okay.
And, you know, I would make the case that this is beyond legitimate, it's necessary, required. So, you know, we will have to be vigilant to make sure that Montana does begin to build up those reserves. All of us need to pay for it. You know, it's a rate impact, but we're using it in effect causing that damage in terms of our electricity use. So I'd be optimistic about that. But again, in Washington State, because it's had so much visibility out there, for example, the settlement on community impacts that Puget and now Avista have committed to, those arose out of lawsuits and regulatory actions. And Puget, I think, is targeting $300+ million for their share of all of those plants in terms of the ultimate reclamation and restoration. And all of the utilities and their regulators and their staffs need to be really aware and sensitive to that. Again, they don't know how long they're going to operate, but at the end of the day, at the end of whatever economic life there is, there's going to be that kind of a liability, and the rates need to reflect that. Yes?
I'm thinking about the bigger picture than just Colstrip. When you mentioned that Montana companies will have the opportunity to respond to this RFP that's out, does that mean that those companies could be located in places all over the state or along the transmission line?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not just localized to...
I mean, from my standpoint, that's the beauty of renewable energy. It's more democratic. It's not concentrated at the mine site, but rather it depends on the renewable resource location, the quality of the wind, the profile of the wind, and so forth. So the reason that I've emphasized the Colstrip component of it is they do have some advantages in terms of the electrical connection and the workforce and the infrastructure, that kind of thing. I think that's positive. So I'm hoping that they're going to get a chunk of it. Okay? I'm also optimistic and hopeful that there are going to be other projects that are successfully bid and loaded on that transmission line that positively impact other communities.
Well, what about the Native American workers who have the mine experience, but they had any chance? That was one of the very few things on the reservation that were high-paying jobs. So, I mean, we hear very little about what will happen to those workers.
The mine workers?
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, the mine side of things is decidedly different than the generation side. Number one, there are no utilities involved. There is no backup in terms of rates. So that is a more vulnerable place to be, for sure. I am hopeful that the state of Montana will make sure that that reclamation work is performed at a high level. I hope they encourage the use of those workers with their equipment operating expertise as doing a lot of that dirt work and reclamation work associated with damage that they have incurred on aquifers as well. I mean, I think back to the early Northern Plains days in terms of the whole reclamation issue. It was a big thing for Northern Plains, and they emphasized, you know, returning it to native grasses, the damage to aquifers. I mean, I remember some of those, the old timers were really zeroed in on that. I don't know how, where that is now in terms of the quality of the reclamation, the requirements, the bonding, now that, you know, Westmoreland is in financial difficulty. But it sure is important. And if they don't do it, then we're gonna end up doing it one way or the other. And it should not be a taxpayer-oriented thing. But that may be the fallback. Yes?
Isn't ballot initiative 186 addressing that maybe it's new lines
Try to,
yeah, if it passes to bond for reclamation?
That's a big part of it. I don't know if there's a grandfather clause that applies to just new. I don't know. I'm sorry to tell you.
Well, Montana and federal strip mine laws have a good bonding requirements. We don't know, and in Montana, we never allowed companies to use their own equipment and kind of holdings as collateral, which they did in Wyoming and do in North Dakota still. So we're in a much better position in Montana to have some resources. I still don't know if it's adequate, but we've definitely got some bonds on those acres.
Well, there's a person that knows a whole lot more about it than I do.
And Dan can speak to it as well.
Pardon?
Oh, I just was saying, I'd be happy to talk about it if anybody would like to as well.
Yes.
You're talking about restoring the aquifer. How do you plan to do that? Because that adversely affects, I'm Ray Pepper's House District 41. My district goes into Colstrip. So I have a lot of people, both in Colstrip and on the Northern Cheyenne Crow reservations, that are affected by this, job-wise, water-wise, air-wise. So how are you going to restore that?
I definitely do not know how to do that.
I'm
But
not
I
saying
am
you, but-
I am definitely committed to getting it done. I know there are, a couple thousand monitoring wells. They know that plume is really extensive. I think they're gonna have some really high-powered work done to identify the extent of it and how it can be mitigated or remedied. I mean, that is a staggering Superfund kind of thing to me. And I am sorry that I'm not more conversant in that. That is not my,
I was just curious because you did mention it. I was the utilities manager for several years on the Northern Cheyenne, and the water is horrible, but it started when Colstrip lost their water as well.
well, I
Yeah, it's-
consider all that tragic.
We just completed a research study looking at some of the techniques. We did a survey for how we would cover that remediation. And we're carrying out a follow-up study, in part using retraining money from the Department of Labor. And there will be an environmental engineer and a hydrologist to dig into the exact techniques and ways to remediate that plume down there, so.
Because your preliminary study looked at how they've done it in other states, different
Yes,
types of stuff you've done to clean groundwater, so
yes.
that's,
So it's a great survey. There are copies back there too, study on the back table. And,
Questions?
As far as the contracts go, RFPs, when the I don't know how to word this, but my understanding is just recently, in the last couple of years, the contract length went from, for new renewable programs, went from 20 years to 5 years, and the rate payments dropped tremendously. Will that, and we lost a lot of projects, will that have an impact on, like, will those same rules apply to these new RFPs?
Those rules and those decisions rest right here in Montana with our commission.
Okay.
And they dealt with contracts that are subject to Northwestern contracts or potential contracts.
Only Northwest.
So that has not been resolved to the best of my knowledge. That's a fatal flaw from my standpoint in terms of our approach to renewables and energy and utility regulation. It's very, very damaging. There were all kinds of news coverage of that at the time. So, we got 2 PSC races up this year. I keep telling people, as long as, unless and until you have people making decisions that you have confidence in, that have the capability and the commitment, within Montana, we're vulnerable. These contracts that I'm talking about, these RFPs, are issued in Washington and Oregon. I think they have a good approach to their integrated resource plans and their RFPs. But the barrier continues to be, okay, why should we contract for a Montana resource, even if it's a little bit more attractive, when they don't have their transmission tied up, their contract tied up? We're ready to enter firm contracts. They're not really ready. So I'm hoping that this project, which is really the first test of, these RFPs, which are really the first test of the recommendations that came from the Montana project, how they affect the way that the commissions and staffs and utilities evaluate Montana resources compared to other alternatives. Again, that's really important, because as the report notes, there's a lot of drive and interest from Montana in terms of getting these projects to market, much less interest out there in terms of buying that power. Even though it's very attractive, it's got a nice shape, it meets their winter peak, it has a lot of nice characteristics, but it's a hell of a long ways away. It's got transmission costs, or it doesn't have transmission. So it's not a slam dunk that they're going to get it, but this really is the first test of kind of this better environment in terms of looking at Montana and the available transmission. So knock on wood, it would be nice to get a couple of good solid contract wins to kind of pave the path for more. That's always a good indicator. Well, Puget got it done, or Portland General got it done despite all of these hurdles. I'd really like to see that.
So should these contracts happen, is there a chance for subcontracts with local preference?
Subcontracts for the
Should some of these
development of the renewables?
General contractors will end up using subcontractors?
Well, you may know more about the labor rules. I would sure encourage that be the case, that there be an emphasis on using Montana and local labor for this work. You're frustrated with me because I don't know the answer.
No, I'm not frustrated, and I guess I'm just kind of frustrated because it's really hard. I understand where Colstrip is coming from, but we always say Colstrip, they're not a bubble. It affects a huge portion of
Sure
the
it
population.
does, sure it does.
And it's we have people who come from Northern Cheyenne, they're not laborers, they are very, very skilled people. Yet they may be the first to go.
Got to make sure that they fight and do have the opportunity for this cleanup as well as the chances to participate in that renewable investment. And so, you know, inviting those developers in, having workshops in terms of we have high quality people, experienced, skilled workforce. I'm thinking that the developers would be making that case in their response to the RFPs. Listen, we are committed to mitigating the impact on the Colstrip area and surrounding community of these changes. That's part of our bid. That's part of the case we want to make to you in Washington and Oregon, that we have real sensitivity and commitment to people that are affected. If I were a developer, that would be part of the case I would make in my RFP response.
Does the Montana PSC have much to say about these contracts between the developer here and the Northwest Utilities?
They have a lot to say about what Northwestern does
Yeah.
in terms of contracts. They won't have anything to say about what the entities in the Northwest decide to do.
So that stuff about 5-year contracts and all that, that doesn't apply to the...
No, I tried to make that clear. Yeah, the 5-year limitations and the approach that the Montana PSC has taken to renewable development does not apply in Washington and Oregon.
That's good news.
Yeah.
But the other barriers in Washington and Oregon remain. And that is, you know, all other things being equal, they'd like to see their people in Washington and Oregon and their projects and their investment in Washington and Oregon get first preference. So having them at the table in terms of this regional project, I think, I'm hoping, really did sensitize them in terms of kind of their responsibility. I mean, after all, they've relied on this Montana coal resource for 40 years. Part of the exit strategy ought to be mitigating some of these impacts. But if that costs real money to their ratepayers, that starts to tip the balance. So, you know, again, no silver bullets here and no slam dunk. They're really going to have to compete for those markets.
Yeah.
And that's why having, at least in my view, having community support and labor support and state of Montana support for this transition and for our ability to compete, not to badmouth them. After all, they're our best, they are our customers, have been for 40 years, and their best customer opportunity going forward is that same customer base in the Northwest. It's not here. We don't have that demand that's going to fill 70% of the Colstrip line. So, I don't know where I was going.
Well, this was about the original time we had budgeted for, so wanted to give folks an opportunity if they had to take off, but definitely free to stick around and answer more questions. I think we should definitely give
Thanks for having me.